They had been called Hitler's Praetorian Guard, the most feared military force in the Third Reich. Men who swore a personal oath, not to Germany, but to one man alone. And then, on May 8, 1945, that man was dead. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But for the men of the Waffen-SS, the war was only beginning to follow them. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what the Waffen-SS actually was, and what it had become. At its peak, the Waffen-SS was the armed wing of Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus, a force of nearly 1 million men drawn from across Nazi-occupied Europe. It included hardened ideological fanatics, career soldiers, foreign volunteers, and, especially in the final years, conscripts who had little choice in the matter. They fought on every front, from the steppes of the Soviet Union to the hedgerows of Normandy. And wherever they went, they left a trail that went far beyond the conventional rules of war. Massacres of civilians in France, the murder of prisoners in Belgium, participation in the Holocaust, directly, systematically, without mercy. Now, in the spring of 1945, millions of these men were marching into captivity, and into an uncertain future. The question wasn't just, what would happen to them? The question was, what do you do with an entire army that has been declared criminal? In 1945 and 1946, the world's attention turned to a small German city and a courtroom that would redefine the concept of justice. At the Nuremberg Trials, the Allied powers did something extraordinary. They didn't just prosecute individuals, they put entire organizations on trial. And in 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict. The SS, in all its forms, was declared a criminal organization. This was legally unprecedented. It meant that mere membership in the SS could be treated as a crime. Not what you did, but who you belonged to. But even in that sweeping judgment, there were cracks. Conscripts, men who had been forced into service with no genuine choice, were largely exempted. Veterans of the Allgemeine SS and the Waffen-SS were treated somewhat differently from the administrative SS that ran the death camps. Still, the declaration sent a clear message to hundreds of thousands of men now shuffling through POW camps. Your organization has been found guilty. What that means for you personally is still being decided. For some, the reckoning came swiftly and without mercy. The commanders of the most infamous SS units faced prosecution. Officers responsible for massacres, like the killing of American POWs at Malmedy, or the annihilation of entire villages in France, were tried, convicted, and in many cases executed. But these men were the exception, not the rule. The sheer scale of the post-war crisis, millions of displaced people, a shattered economy, a Europe that needed rebuilding immediately, meant that pursuing every former SS man was simply impossible. Slowly, the camps began to empty. Lower-ranking members, once screened and cleared, were released into a West Germany still digging itself out of the rubble. And here is where the story gets complicated. Because returning home wasn't a fresh start. For a former Waffen-SS veteran, it came with a very specific stigma and a very specific problem. In post-war West Germany, former SS members were initially barred from receiving pensions. They were excluded from civil service. They couldn't wear their decorations. They couldn't speak publicly about their service without risking legal consequences. To the German state, at least officially, these men were not veterans. They were something else entirely. But history rarely stays still, and politics rarely stays principled for long. By the early 1950s, the geopolitical landscape of Europe had transformed completely. The Soviet Union loomed large. The United States needed West Germany as a bulwark against communist expansion. And West Germany needed an army. The new West German military, the Bundeswehr, was being built from scratch. And inevitably, the question arose, could former Wehrmacht officers be recruited? Could former Waffen-SS veterans? The answer, officially, was largely no. For SS men. The Bundeswehr screened applicants carefully, and most former SS members were rejected. But simultaneously, the political winds were shifting in another direction. Under pressure from veterans groups, West Germany's government quietly began extending pension rights to former Waffen-SS men. The argument, made repeatedly and loudly by lobbying organizations, was simple. These men served their country. They followed orders. they should not be punished for life. It was a narrative that sounded reasonable and concealed a great deal. In 1951, a new organization quietly took shape in West Germany. It was called HIAG, a name long enough to obscure what it really was. In plain terms, a veterans association for former Waffen-SS members. But HIAG was more than a support group. It was a political lobbying machine, and a very effective one. HIAG pushed relentlessly for pension rights. It cultivated allies in West Germany's parliament. It produced publications, organized reunions, and, most crucially, worked to reshape the public narrative around what the Waffen-SS had actually been. Their central argument was seductive in its simplicity. The Waffen-SS were soldiers, frontline fighters, ordinary men doing their military duty, no different from any other German soldier. They had a name for it. The clean Wehrmacht myth extended now to cover the Waffen-SS as well. For a time, it worked. By the mid-1950s, many West German politicians, including members of Konrad Adenauer's government, were openly sympathetic to HIAG's claims. Some even attended SS veterans reunions. The rehabilitation seemed almost complete. But history has a way of reasserting itself. The 1960s began to crack the facade. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials forced West Germany to confront the industrial machinery of the Holocaust in painful public detail. A new generation, young Germans who had not fought in the war, began to ask questions their parents refused to answer. And by the 1970s and 1980s, investigative journalists, historians, and documentary makers were systematically dismantling the myths that HIAG had spent decades constructing. The evidence was overwhelming. The Waffen-SS had not been separated from the ideological crimes of the Nazi regime. SS divisions had participated in mass shootings. SS men had guarded concentration camps. The line between the combat soldier and the racial enforcer, which HIAG had worked so hard to draw, did not exist. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1990, Germany reunified, and with a unified Germany came a renewed confrontation with the full weight of the Nazi past. HIAG dissolved in 1992, not with a bang, but with a quiet acknowledgement that its central argument had lost the argument of history. But the story didn't end there. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, controversies continued to surface. Debates over SS veterans' pensions, arguments over whether SS insignia could be displayed at memorials, legal battles over far-right groups using Waffen-SS symbols and rhetoric. And every few years, another case, another elderly man, living quietly somewhere in Germany or abroad, would be identified, charged, and brought to court. Not as a symbol, but as an individual who had made choices. The courts, in their way, insisted. The passage of time does not erase the act. Today, the last surviving members of the Waffen-SS are in their late 90s or beyond. The organization that shaped their lives and devastated millions of others has been gone for 8 decades, but its shadow still falls. The Waffen-SS remains one of history's most studied examples of how an institution can commit extraordinary crimes, and then, almost successfully, rewrite its own story. It is a lesson in the mechanics of historical memory, in how narratives are constructed, defended, and, eventually, overturned. Because the truth, as it turns out, is not patient forever. But it does require someone willing to dig. The men of the Waffen-SS did not disappear into history quietly. They lobbied, they organized, they told their story, the version they preferred. For a generation, much of Germany listened. But history kept its own record, and the echoes of that record, the trials, the testimony, the evidence buried in archives across Europe, continue to reshape how we understand not just the Waffen-SS, but the way power memory and moral responsibility interact long after the guns fall silent. The question they leave behind is not just about them, it's about us. What stories do we allow to be rewritten? And who decides when a myth has lasted long enough? If stories like this, the ones that fell through the cracks of the history books, the ones that got complicated after the cameras left, if those are the stories that keep you up at night, then hit subscribe, because there are hundreds more waiting. And drop a comment below. What part of this surprised you most? We read everyone.